At the heart of the story lies a deeply nuanced exploration of an emotional connection that blossoms within the professional confines of a corporate environment. The narrative follows Isabelle, a dedicated senior executive who has spent over a decade at her firm, and Nathan, her longtime superior, a man of influence and composed authority. Their relationship begins within the boundaries of mutual professional respect, structured, respectful, and built on years of shared responsibilities and strategic collaboration. However, over time, subtle moments accumulate: late-night meetings, shared confidences, and the unspoken intimacy of mutual reliance. These seemingly insignificant interactions evolve into something more personal and emotionally charged. The annual company gala becomes a pivotal moment. Under the shimmering city lights and the post-event quiet, a simple invitation to a nightcap turns into an unraveling of boundaries. In a dimly lit jazz lounge, words unspoken for years surface, about dreams deferred, admiration suppressed, and the longing for connection beyond professional veneers. The setting, corporate office towers, rooftop terraces, and quiet city corners, reflects the duality of their lives, one of routine and order, the other of suppressed emotions yearning for expression. What makes their connection poignant is not only the obvious conflict of interest but also the underlying fear of jeopardizing careers, of facing judgment, and of confronting long-suppressed emotions. Isabelle, torn between duty and desire, finds herself awakening to feelings she had buried beneath years of structure and self-discipline. Nathan, once the embodiment of restraint and professionalism, reveals a vulnerable side shaped by years of solitude and emotional detachment. This is not merely a romance. It is an introspective journey through the emotional minefield of professional attachment, the weight of unspoken admiration, and the human desire for authenticity in a world of pretense. The story invites readers to question: can genuine connection survive within the framework of power dynamics, or must it remain hidden in the quiet spaces between meetings and glances? The days that followed their late-night confession unfolded in quiet contradiction. Isabelle moved through the familiar corridors of the office with practiced grace, greeting colleagues, attending meetings, and delivering strategic updates. On the surface, everything remained unchanged. Yet beneath that polished exterior, her world had begun to shift. She often found her gaze drawn to Nathan's office, glass walls, open yet impenetrable. And occasionally, when he looked up from behind his desk, their eyes would meet. Brief, measured, intense. It was in these fleeting glances that the echoes of their intimate evening reverberated most clearly. Nathan, ever composed, had subtly changed too. His presence felt heavier, more deliberate. He passed by her desk more than usual, lingered at the end of meetings, and once, only once, allowed his fingers to graze hers when handing over a report. That brief touch lit a wildfire of memory beneath her skin. On a rain-soaked Thursday evening, she received a message from him. "May I see you outside the office tonight?" She hesitated. For over a decade, she had defined herself by boundaries. She'd stayed within the lines, never indulging, never slipping. Her career had been a fortress. But Nathan had unlocked something. Not only desire, but a longing for recognition, for being seen not just as a professional, but as a woman with her own quiet hunger. She replied simply, yes. That evening, they met at a small bistro nestled in the quieter quarter of the city. No suits, no formalities. Nathan wore a soft gray sweater, and Isabelle, for the first time, let her hair fall freely. The sight of each other out of context, free from the symbols of their roles, sent a tremor through the space between them. He smiled, almost nervously. I wasn't sure you'd come. She offered a quiet laugh. Neither was I. They didn't speak of the office. Instead, they shared stories of their youth, of cities visited and books half-read. They spoke of what-ifs and almosts, of the loneliness that often hides behind ambition. Over wine and candlelight, the years between them seemed to dissolve. But as the night deepened, so did the weight of unspoken truths. "Nathan," she finally whispered, "what are we doing?" He looked at her, unflinching. "Something terrifying, but maybe necessary." Isabelle lowered her gaze, afraid of what she might find in his eyes: fear, hesitation, or worse, indifference. But all she found was longing, tempered by respect. "I don't want this to be reckless," she said. "I don't want to be someone's escape." He reached across the table, took her hand in his, and said, "You're not an escape, Isabelle. You're the first real thing I've felt in years." In that moment, Isabelle felt herself unraveling, not in fear, but in surrender. Not to him, but to a part of herself she had silenced for too long. The world outside continued, unaware. But within the small circle of light that wrapped around their table, something undeniable had taken root, delicate, complicated, but undeniably real. The story delicately explores a profound and relatable dilemma, one that strikes at the heart of human vulnerability, the tension between professional ethics and the rising tide of personal emotion. For Isabelle, a seasoned executive who has built her identity through discipline and performance, the emerging feelings for Nathan, her direct superior, thrust her into an emotional quagmire. Her mind clings to structure, to policy, to the unwritten rules of corporate life that have protected her for so long. She knows that even the appearance of impropriety could shatter years of dedication, tarnish her reputation, or worse, reduce her entire professional journey to whispers in boardroom corners. And yet, her heart rebels. What began as admiration for Nathan's leadership, his poise, and quiet intelligence slowly transformed. It was the late-night calls discussing company strategy that bled into stories of loss and ambition. The way he remembered small things about her. The rare vulnerability in his voice when he spoke of regrets. In those moments, he ceased to be just a figure of authority. He became human. Nathan, too, is caught in a quiet storm. He has spent decades mastering control, embodying professionalism. But Isabelle stirs something in him he had long buried under spreadsheets and silent dinners. He knows the ethical landscape he stands on. He is her superior, a gatekeeper of opportunity and evaluation. Any step toward intimacy risks the perception of favoritism, or worse, manipulation. Yet neither of them can ignore the unspoken language building between them, the glances that linger too long, the way conversation drifts into personal spaces, the pull of presence that becomes impossible to ignore. Isabelle lies awake at night, staring at the ceiling, asking herself the hard questions. Am I jeopardizing everything I've worked for? Is this real, or is it just loneliness disguised as connection? Would I still want this if we weren't tied by hierarchy and habit? She questions not only Nathan's intentions but her own. Do I want him? Or do I want to be seen, truly seen, by someone who knows my worth? For Nathan, the guilt is equally complex. He questions if he's taking advantage of proximity, of trust. Even though he sees Isabelle as his equal, he knows that the imbalance of power, regardless of how emotionally honest he tries to be, complicates everything. Their internal conflict isn't just about forbidden desire. It's about identity, integrity, and fear of being reduced by others' perceptions. It's about the haunting possibility that this rare and genuine connection may be judged not for what it is, but for what it looks like. In every shared silence and every near touch, they teeter on the edge, two professionals trying to navigate the most human of experiences while bound by roles that were never meant to contain emotion. The days after their second night together passed not with fireworks, but with silence, dense, contemplative silence. Isabelle returned to the office on Monday morning cloaked in her usual professionalism. Her attire was crisp, her posture poised, and her expression unreadable. But inside, a quiet war waged. Every task, every meeting, every interaction seemed blurred by the echo of Nathan's touch, his voice whispering truths she wasn't sure she was ready to live with. Nathan, too, had withdrawn slightly, not coldly, but cautiously. He still acknowledged her with that private glance, still lingered in conversation when they crossed paths. But she could sense the careful recalibration in his demeanor. The line they had tiptoed across was now stark and pulsing between them. During a budget review with the executive board, Isabelle found herself distracted. Nathan sat across the table, effortlessly guiding the conversation. No one else seemed to notice the subtle tension, how her gaze avoided his, how his fingers drummed an unfamiliar rhythm against the polished table. Only they knew what hung in the balance. Later that evening, Isabelle stood alone on the same office terrace where it had all begun. The city's lights blinked at her like a Morse code of memory. She knew he would come. And when he did, neither of them spoke for a long while. At last, she broke the silence. I keep thinking that if we were in different circumstances, if you were anyone else. Nathan's voice was steady. But I'm not. She nodded, her throat tightening. And I'm not either. We've built too much to be careless. He stepped closer, careful not to touch her. Do you regret it? No, her voice was firm. But I fear what it might cost us. Nathan looked out over the skyline. I've built my life on knowing the risks worth taking. But you. I'd never want you to sacrifice something you worked so hard to earn. Isabelle's heart clenched. She had never needed protection, yet something in his restraint felt more intimate than any embrace. Then maybe, she said quietly, we take a step back. Just for now. Let the dust settle. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. If that's what you need. She turned to him, eyes searching his. It's not about what I need. It's about doing this right. And so, they agreed, not to end, but to pause. To respect the lines between them while they figured out how to redraw them with integrity. It wasn't a dramatic farewell. No tears. No final kiss. Just a shared understanding. Love, if that's what it was, didn't have to be reckless to be real. But as Isabelle walked back into the glowing hum of the office, something lingered in her heart. The distance they chose was not the end. It was a promise, soft and unwritten. Some things, she realized, are worth waiting for. Weeks passed. Not with absence, but with presence, deliberate, quiet, watchful. Isabelle and Nathan returned to their professional roles with practiced ease, each performing the part expected of them. Meetings resumed, strategies were refined, and their team remained oblivious to the unspoken thread still linking the two of them. But everything had changed. Their conversations became precise, layered with dual meanings. When Nathan offered feedback on her presentation, Isabelle heard the warmth beneath the critique. When Isabelle gave updates in the conference room, Nathan's eyes lingered for a second longer than necessary. The line they had drawn between them didn't erase the connection, it magnified it. Outside the office, life continued with its usual demands. Isabelle attended her friend's engagement dinner and sat through a symphony of romantic toasts. She smiled politely, but something inside her flickered, a quiet recognition that her heart was tethered elsewhere, waiting. Nathan buried himself in work. Late nights. Board presentations. Travel. Yet even as he crossed cities and time zones, his mind drifted to her. There were moments in hotel rooms when he would almost text her, just to say goodnight. But he didn't. Not yet. One afternoon, as autumn began to seep into the city, Isabelle found herself alone in the break room. A colleague joked about workplace romance, prompting laughter from the group. She smiled, masking the twist in her chest. After they left, she stood at the window, coffee in hand, heart suspended between resolve and yearning. Then came the unexpected, an invitation. Not from Nathan, but from HR, routine, procedural, yet jarring. A quiet reminder that the professional world had rules, and that rumors, even false ones, could bloom in silence. Someone had noticed the glances. The proximity. Perhaps even the energy they both tried so hard to conceal. Isabelle sat through the meeting with calm dignity, answering questions with clarity. There was nothing formal to disclose. Nothing had happened, at least, nothing that policy would define. Still, the experience left her unsettled. That evening, she called Nathan. "We need to talk," she said simply. They met not at a restaurant or terrace, but in the library of a quiet hotel, neutral, private, safe. Isabelle didn't wait. Someone noticed. "I was questioned today." Nathan's face hardened. "I'm sorry, you don't need to apologize," she said softly. "But we need to decide how we move forward." For real. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he sat beside her, hands folded, brow furrowed in thought. "I've thought about stepping back," he said eventually. "Handing over some responsibilities. Creating distance, officially." Her heart ached at his words, though she knew they came from care. "Would you really do that?" He nodded. "Yes. If it meant you could breathe." She closed her eyes. This wasn't romance in its cinematic sense. It was hard, real, imperfect. But it was also rare. She reached for his hand, this time without hesitation. "I don't want us to vanish. But I don't want us to be reckless, either." "Then we find a middle ground," Nathan said. "We rebuild. Carefully. Honestly." Isabelle leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, just for a moment. The connection was still there, quiet but steadfast. Whatever they were building, it wouldn't be defined by stolen moments or scandal. It would be shaped by patience, respect, and the courage to love in a world that often didn't make space for such things. The decision wasn't made in a single moment, but over many small ones, conversations whispered in safe spaces, glances that no longer flinched away, and the growing recognition that what they shared was neither fleeting nor fragile. 2 months after their last conversation, Nathan officially announced his transition into a new role, one that placed him in a broader, more strategic position, away from Isabelle's direct chain of command. It was a move long considered, but the timing now bore deeper purpose. There were murmurs, as expected. Whispers of change always invite speculation. But Isabelle met the gossip with quiet resolve. She no longer needed to defend what was still unfolding. What mattered was integrity, not in explanation, but in conduct. In their newfound space, the dynamic between them shifted, not towards something reckless or indulgent, but intentional. Isabelle no longer carried the weight of secrecy. She still held boundaries, still honored her career, but within her, a new confidence stirred, that two adults could forge a connection without shame, as long as honesty led the way. One evening, under the amber lights of an intimate wine bar tucked behind an old bookshop, Nathan reached across the table, not with hesitation this time, but with clarity. "I've missed this," he said. Isabelle smiled. "So have I." There were no grand declarations, no ultimatums. Just presence. Commitment not to an outcome, but to truth. They began to spend time together outside the shadows, slowly, respectfully. They attended a gallery opening. Took a weekend drive to a nearby vineyard. Small acts that, together, built a foundation more lasting than a hidden affair ever could. At work, Isabelle flourished. Her decisions became sharper. Her voice, more grounded. Nathan never tried to intervene in her career. He respected her space, her mind, her ambition. Their love didn't eclipse who she was. It enriched her. One late afternoon, as they strolled through a quiet park where leaves rustled like memory, Isabelle paused. "Do you ever think about how fragile this could have been?" she asked. Nathan looked at her, his gaze steady. "It's still fragile. But anything worth holding always is." She nodded, then took his hand, this time without fear, without caution. They had crossed the tightrope between professionalism and vulnerability, not by leaping, but by walking slowly, with eyes open and heart steady. And in doing so, they found something many only dream of. A connection born not from secrecy, but from choice. Just when Isabelle began to believe in the calm, a shadow returned from Nathan's past, graceful, poised, and unexpectedly present. Her name was Claire, a former partner of Nathan's, once involved both personally and professionally in the early days of his company. She had been gone for nearly a decade, pursuing ventures abroad, yet her name still lingered in occasional mentions, mostly in reverent tones from colleagues who remembered her sharp mind and her role in Nathan's rise. Now, she was back. And not just for a visit. Claire had accepted a board position at the parent firm, a role that would place her in direct contact with Nathan and, occasionally, Isabelle. The first time Isabelle met her in person was at a leadership roundtable. Claire was warm, articulate, and utterly composed. There was no visible animosity, but the undertone was clear. She knew more about Nathan than most, perhaps even more than Isabelle herself. After the meeting, Nathan found Isabelle on the elevator ride down. "She reached out to me before accepting," he said gently. "Wanted to be transparent." Isabelle forced a smile. "That's generous of her." Nathan studied her carefully. "I'm telling you because I want there to be no confusion between us. What we have, what we're building, it's not something I intend to compromise." "I know," she said quietly, but inside, old doubts began to stir. It wasn't about jealousy. It was about history, the kind that runs deep and has its own language. Isabelle couldn't compete with memories she wasn't part of. And watching Claire glide through familiar hallways, warmly greeted by Nathan's oldest allies, reminded her of that. That week, Isabelle became quieter. She buried herself in work, pushed harder, stayed later. Nathan noticed. One evening, he waited for her outside the building. "You're shutting me out," he said. "I'm not," she replied, voice tight. "I'm just focused." Nathan didn't press. But the silence between them became louder. It all came to a head during a team retreat. After a long day of workshops, Isabelle stepped onto the balcony of the resort to find Claire already there, glass of wine in hand. "You're remarkable," Claire said, without preamble. "Nathan speaks highly of you." Isabelle remained still. Thank you. Claire turned, her eyes steady. I care about him, you know. I always will. But I also know when a chapter has closed. The words landed like a soft blow, unexpectedly kind, yet still jarring. Claire continued, he's different with you. Quieter. More certain. Don't let ghosts rattle you. We all carry them. Later that night, Isabelle found Nathan by the fireplace in the lounge. Without words, she sat beside him, slipping her hand into his. He turned, gently kissed her knuckles, and whispered, "Still with me?" She nodded. Still. And just like that, the shadows began to fade, not erased, but acknowledged. They had talked about it in fragments, during quiet dinners, in long walks through autumn streets, in shared glances across the conference table. But now, the time for tentative words had passed. It began with a simple decision. Isabelle and Nathan would attend the firm's annual leadership gala together. Not as a boss and his direct report. Not as two executives who happened to arrive at the same time. But as something more. Isabelle's heart raced as the night approached. Not out of shame, no, not anymore, but from the weight of what it meant. They weren't breaking rules. Nathan had stepped away from any position of influence over her months ago. Yet perceptions were powerful things, and she knew the office, the industry, the world, they all had opinions ready to be whispered. Nathan, for his part, was calm. Not indifferent, but grounded. We're not asking for approval, he said that evening as he helped her into her coat. We're simply choosing honesty. They arrived together. Walked through the entrance together. Stood side by side as they greeted familiar faces, some surprised, some subtly amused, and a few, mostly older executives, silently disapproving. But Isabelle held her head high. She had fought hard to become the woman she was, respected, competent, and now, finally, whole. She owed no one an apology for finding love that did not diminish her but honored her. As the evening progressed, a few colleagues approached with cautious congratulations. One of Isabelle's peers, someone she'd mentored for years, took her aside. You know people will talk, she said gently. I know, Isabelle replied. Let them. Then came the board chair, a stern, by-the-book woman who had always been supportive of Isabelle's rise. I see you've come with Nathan tonight, she said. Yes, Isabelle replied, steady. There was a pause, then the chair nodded. You've both handled this with care. That matters. When the night drew to a close, and Isabelle and Nathan stepped back into the cool evening air, the city buzzed around them with the distant hum of possibility. Was it what you expected? He asked. Not at all, she said. But better. They walked in silence for a while, hand in hand, no longer needing to look over their shoulders. The truth was out, not shouted, not flaunted, but quietly and unmistakably present. What they had was no longer a fragile secret. It had become a choice. A shared truth. A life they were beginning, together. Months passed since the gala, and Isabelle found herself adjusting to a new kind of life. One where her relationship with Nathan no longer hid in the folds of routine. Their connection had deepened not only through intimacy, but through structure, scheduling around each other, cooking together on Sundays, sharing the weight of decision-making in both life and career. But one morning, as she looked across the breakfast table and saw Nathan reading the paper in his robe, a quiet ache settled in her chest, not of doubt, but of longing. She realized something. Love was no longer the question. It was the future. They had never spoken of marriage, not directly. Isabelle, fiercely independent for most of her adult life, had learned to protect herself from expectation. And Nathan, older, once divorced, seemed content with the way things were. But that morning, as sunlight warmed the kitchen tiles and their life felt almost too peaceful, she whispered, "Do you ever think about what comes next for us?" Nathan looked up, folding the paper. "I think about it all the time," she exhaled. And he reached for her hand across the table. "I want a life with you, not just evenings and weekends. I want something whole." Later that week, Nathan brought her to a quiet cottage just outside the city, nothing grand, just serene. The lake was still, and the trees were beginning to green with the first whispers of spring. There, as they stood on the deck, the wind brushing against their cheeks, he took out a small velvet box, but he didn't kneel. Instead, he simply opened it, revealing a simple, elegant band. "No performance," he said softly. "Just a question. Will you build this life with me, on your terms, as your equal, for as long as we both have breath to give?" Tears welled in Isabelle's eyes, not from surprise, but from the quiet certainty of it. "Yes," she replied. "But only if we keep choosing it. Every day." Nathan smiled. "Always." They didn't rush. There was no wedding announcement the next day, no formal plans made over champagne. Instead, they returned to the city and kept living, together, fully, without shame or spectacle. At work, Isabelle continued to ascend, now seen not as someone attached to Nathan, but as someone beside him. And when whispers returned, as they sometimes did, she no longer flinched, because she knew who she was, and she knew what they had chosen. Not perfection, not fantasy, but a shared truth, and the quiet courage to live it out, one decision at a time. Spring gave way to summer, and with it, a sense of fullness settled over Isabelle and Nathan's life together. They found rhythm in shared mornings, late-night conversations, and the kind of ease that comes from being seen completely, and still chosen. But life, as it often does, offered its own lesson in fragility. It began with a tremor in Nathan's hand. Barely noticeable. A flicker, then stillness. Then again, while buttoning his shirt, while pouring tea. At first, he brushed it off, but Isabelle noticed. One evening, she reached across the dinner table, gently stilling his hand with hers. "It's time to see someone." The diagnosis came a week later, early onset Parkinson's. Nathan sat still as the neurologist explained the prognosis. Isabelle's hand never left his. When they stepped into the daylight afterward, the world seemed cruelly unchanged, bright, bustling, unaware. He turned to her. "This changes everything." "No," she said softly. "It just changes how we walk through it." In the months that followed, their routine transformed. There were hospital visits, medications, adjustments to daily life. But also, more laughter. More intentional time. More grace. Nathan struggled, not just with the physical symptoms, but the fear of becoming a burden. One evening, as they sat on the rooftop watching the sun dip behind the skyline, he finally said what he'd been holding back. "You didn't sign up for this." "No," Isabelle replied. "I signed up for you." She rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the rhythmic beat of his heart. "We don't control the seasons, but we choose who we weather them with." And so they did. Their wedding was small, just family and a few close friends, held in the same quiet lakeside cottage where he had offered her the ring. Claire attended too, offering a quiet hug and a knowing smile. Years passed. Nathan's condition progressed, but slowly. Isabelle continued to thrive in her field, becoming a mentor to women across the industry, quietly known not just for her brilliance, but for the strength of a love that never bowed to fear. In a letter she wrote to herself one winter morning, tucked away in a journal she kept private, she penned the words, "I thought love would look like fire. But instead, it came like still water, deep, enduring, and quietly saving me from myself."